Welcome everyone to this webinar on board's dynamic capabilities. And if we can change the slides, I just want to give you a very quick overview of the amazing guests we have here today. So we have Professor Ludo van der Heyden from INSEAD, Professor Mats Magnusson from KTH here in Stockholm, David Koning, CEO of DSRO, and also a board member, and Helen Wiseman, that is a board member and the chair. And me, myself, I'm the operations director here at Board Impact Forum, also a board director. And we have with us also Liselott Engstam, that is the chair of Board's Impact Forum. Before we get started, I would just like to give you a bit, you can change the slide, give you a bit of an overview over the agenda for today. So we are going to start with a brief introduction with Liselott on some insights. We are going to talk about changing board practices from loss avoidance to learning to embrace risk with David Koning. And then we dive into dynamic board capabilities. So the published research that we published very recently on the concept of sensing, pivoting, and aligning, and how this can impact at board level, how can impact the firm results with Mats Magnusson, and board oversight of sustainability and AI, and how these are related to board dynamic capabilities with Professor Ludo van der Heyden. Then we, as usual, we go into breakout rooms, we discuss these topics, and we come back, we have a panel discussion also together with Helen Wiseman at the panel. So if we go into the next slide, it would be really, really good if we could ask everyone to mute themselves in this first part of the webinar. And we are recording this first part of the webinar. It might be that we are also recording or publishing the panel, but let's see how the discussion evolves. And we really want to encourage you to use the chat to share your thoughts, ideas, references, etc. To get us started, it would be great if you could go to the chat right now and just type where you are calling from, a little bit about yourself. If you have any technical issues, just drop us an email. If you want to, and I think it would be great if you would take the lead now, Liselott, on the context that we are in.
So, as if you did not know, we have never been in a situation that is as slow as it will ever be going forward. So we have so many changing things coming at us. It's the technology disruption, it's the AI, cybersecurity, the data. We have the entire environmental challenge with the climate change, with all dimensions of the sustainability pressures. We have a global instability, we have inflation, we have supply chain disruptions, and then we have an increasing geopolitical tensions with wars. We have a lot of regulatory changes that comes at us with different pace. And on and on. So actually, it's never been more interesting to be in a board position, slightly challenging to keep ourselves updated. We just picked out to get us into a bit of a board mode. This is actually from a research from Ernst & Young, where we just wanted to point out that there's so many big topics. Our biggest issue is actually getting time to discuss it in a proper way so we can get into an agreement on what are the big things that is impacting us. And we are working to try to change the way we are structuring ourselves and in different committees, but we're still very much in a flux on how board work should work. That in itself actually made for some really interesting research that we've been doing together with Professor Ludo van der Heyden and Professor Magnusson over a number of years, we've actually looked into how do boards handle different versions of corporate renewal. And this is now the thing that we have documented with some fantastic results in a new research paper. And one of the reasons then that we actually, I also wanted to point out that we have several members here that was also part of writing the paper. So Henrik Forselius and Fernanda and myself was also part of writing this paper. If you can't remember anything else from this, is that sensing, pivoting, and aligning is actually 3 core areas where the new types of transformative boards is actually performing better. And that is what we have tried to look at in a number of years. Now, one of the persons that actually edited this entire magazine that was talking about this was our dear colleague David Koenig, who's the president and founder of the Risk Governance Institute that provides discussion circles, educations for both board directors and C-suites across the world. He's also served on a number of boards, both for-profit and non-profit. And he has a long, strong background in actually what he himself refers to swimming upwards, trying to get boards to understand how to handle risk in companies. We're super delighted to have you here, David. Warm welcome.
Thank you, Liselott. Very nice to join you. Would you like me to start?
Yeah, do you want to take it over?
Sure, I can try and share, and then if that doesn't work, we'll stick with your slides. I'm going to have to get it into display mode in a second here, so let me do that, and then let me know if you see the presentation now?
Yes, we do.
Okay, so Liselott and I were connected a couple of years back when our organization was starting to look at running a course on what we called innovation. And innovation, as you'll see in this very brief presentation, is central to long-term value creation. But it's not just a simple thing. It's not just a simple process. But as Liselott and I had talked, one of the things that board members struggle with is thinking that innovation is actually part of their responsibility. And that's where this term corporate renewal was first introduced to me. And Liselott has said it's really a tested expression because it does get board members interested, because corporate renewal is something they feel like is their responsibility, whereas innovation they think is an executive function. But innovation in that corporate renewal is about creating an environment and understanding the things that are needed for successful continued growth and survival and sustainability. So the title of this very brief discussion is From Loss Avoidance to Learning to Embrace Risk. Rachel Johnson is out there, Lale is out there, Helen, they all know this is central to how I approach risk governance and the way in which we teach things. So I'm going to take you again very quickly through some slides, but I want you to know about the psychology of risk and how it impacts your decisions. There's a whole lot more I'm happy to share with you on each of these things, but what I want you to first understand is your brain is making a mathematical decision on almost everything you decide to do, including coming to this session today. You may not realize it's doing this because often it's doing it through heuristics and very quick references to things that help it decide whether something is a good thing for you to be spending your own energy on. But it can be boiled down to what I call the value equation, which looks at what you expect to get from, in most cases, a relationship or an activity, and how that's valued today to decide if you're going to exchange time, resources, whatever it might be. So very simply in this equation, the U's across the top, those are the things you expect to get. They have numbers on them, meaning they come at different points in time. At the very far right is an ellipsis, which suggests a lot of these relationships go on for a long period of time. And on the bottom is something called discount rates, or as somebody recently suggested to me, I start calling them disappointment rates, because the idea in this value equation and the way in which your brain is processing it is to say, what is the chance that my expectations won't be met? So it doesn't mean there has to be loss, but loss from what expectations are. So as you might expect, the higher the chance of being disappointed, the lower the value of a relationship or a transaction. And this cuts across whether you decide to eat at a restaurant, whether you're going to put $1 billion into a new project, or any decision you make about a friendship, for example. Now, this is Lisa Lotta and I did not coordinate, but we basically have the same slide. Mine's got a few more words on it, but pretty much the same idea. This is a really challenging environment. Almost every board member I talked to said it's the most challenging environment they've ever faced. And what we say back to them is it's probably the least challenging environment for the rest of your career because of the dynamism of all of these things. So what's the danger in this? The danger is that our brains process risk first on an emotional level. So if we perceive threat, if we perceive high degrees of uncertainty, if we perceive things that might not go as we expect, it's that quick response that's deeply ingrained in us, the fight or flight response, that shuts down the cognitive side of our thinking. And the cognitive side of our thinking is what's critical, particularly at the board level, for strategic planning. So trying to learn to embrace risk is trying to get over this emotional trigger, trying to get to a place of comfort in making decisions. And so if you are focused only on the downside, so let's say, for example, you have an audit committee or an audit risk committee or risk committee, and the main job the chief risk officer has is to come in and tell you everything that can go wrong, it's going to make it more difficult for you to go through a process of corporate renewal. There is particular evidence on large threats. So for example, if you think a threat might be existential, could be around cyber, could be around any financial loss, could be around a pandemic, whatever it might be. If it's perceived as particularly large, you may wind up demanding 2 to 3 times the expected gain in order to commit to taking that risk. So that eliminates some really important small risks we might be taking in this innovation cycle. So on net, we lose our ability to think strategically when we're afraid. So we want to get past this. We want to learn to embrace risk and not have a focus just on survival. This chart is one that I use often. I'm going to direct everybody to this book by Bart Madden. Bart's the guy who's shown here. Any of you out there who have a CFA designation or work in finance may be familiar with a term called cash flow return on investment, CFROI. That's something that Bart created back in the 1960s. Bart and I have come to know each other recently because we have a very aligned way of thinking about risk taking and the need for it. So in his book and in lots of other places, and I use this in at least one of my books, is this cycle that I show in front of you. And it's a cycle, it's a cycle to show the life cycle of an innovation, of a product, of a company. Most times when we have something that we're experimenting with at the very left in this high innovation phase, we're actually losing money on it because it's not generating any revenue. But if it's a good product, good idea, it very quickly reaches a stage where its economic returns are well in excess of the long-term cost of capital of funding those. That's the horizontal line that you see there. Very quickly, though, we can move into what he refers to as a phase called competitive fade, which means we become complacent. Competitors realize we're making a lot on a particular idea. They start to copy us. They start to offer substitutes. We might run into inefficiencies. This eventually drives us down to this mature stage where basically we're not creating any economic value out of this particular initiative. It's generating returns equal to the cost of capital. And if we don't do anything about it, we move into this failing business model, which is where we're starting to destroy value. The only way to beat this cycle is to continuously innovate, continuously bring new ideas into the fold, continuously try new things so that when we have this fade cycle on one business unit, one product, there's another product or another idea coming behind it in the high innovation phase. And there's actually good evidence out of complexity science and physics as well for this need of survivability of an organization. So again, very quickly, to get to this phase, we have to attract capital. We have to attract capital in all different kinds of forms. This is a very simple diagram of who's in our social network, who are the various capital providers, and the lines suggest communication. So every one of these communicates with the other, and they impact our ability to pursue the goals that we set as an organization. There is a feedback and feed forward cycle that these capital providers are getting back to that value equation and how their brains work. To get started, we need to attract their capital. We have to have a good story. We have to have something that gets them the first time they run that value equation in their heads to say, yes, I'm willing to commit intellectual, financial capital, whatever it might be, to this project. Then it's our job as an organization to effectively take risk in pursuit of what we told them as our story. When we do that, we give them their first feedback. So that's the very first point at which they have some data from us on whether we've disappointed them or perhaps, ideally, surprised them with even better results than what they expected. Now we get into the single most important part of that value equation, and that's this feed forward mechanism. This is all about anticipation. This is everything else in that value equation that goes out from time zero. How is it that you communicate to these capital providers that they should trust you? Feedback is one part of it, but since this impact of perceptions of risk of disappointment going forward has an exponential impact on the value today, this is even more critical. So this is where good governance, good transparency, good communication, good understanding of risk, good business plans, all of that communicates out to these capital providers that they can trust you. And when this cycle works well, we create value for everyone in it, and the cycle continues. So again, very short tour through that particular thing. But part of getting there means we have to start redefining what we mean by risk. And in this case, I use firm risk. But if you start to think about risk as anything that stands in the way of fulfilling your purpose, it gives you a different framework for it. It's not what can go wrong. It's what is it that we need to address? Where do we improve and innovate? This is an opportunity when we start talking about risk. We need to take an empathetic approach, which is to look at the perspective of everyone who provides their capital to us, which we'll just call stakeholders, capital providers, because that's what they are. We need to understand taking risk is necessary for our existence and continued existence, getting back to Bart Madden's chart, and embrace risk-taking as normal. It's something we do and we have to do. I'm going to skip this slide, but this is something we use with boards to help them understand the overall risk posture and risk profile of the board. We do this with executive committees as well. Happy to talk about that more later. But understanding whether your board's psychological makeup towards risk-taking aligns with what your company thinks it's doing is really important for effective risk governance and risk-taking. So with that, I will end my time, and hopefully I was on a reasonable, got reasonably close to my 10 minutes.
Thank you so much, David. You were actually spot on. So it was very nice and very good. And I think your presentation is so good because it reminds us that if we all just dig around the risks without looking at the upside of the risks, we actually are not able, even psychologically in our brains, to take good decisions.
Correct.
And since we're also handling here kind of both the business side, but also the sustainability side, I think it's a fantastic message to understand that if we just pump the risk side, we won't get people to act.
That's correct. Yep. And that's incredibly important from the standpoint of the environment we're in right now, which can easily freeze us. So yeah, I'm happy to go into that more detail when we have discussion too.
Yes, thank you so much, David. Now we are delighted to introduce Professor Mats Magnusson, who has led this research with us. And Mats has led both this research and other research on boards, and is really a core guru on innovation research, which you guys all now need to go into. So when you get stuck, he's the guy to actually contact on the topic. And he teaches also leadership all across the world. So Mats, warm welcome.
Thank you very much, Liselott. First of all, I realize that picture can get me in trouble. That would be false advertisements. It's kind of old. But I've been given the task here to briefly present our publication, a paper called Dynamic Board Capabilities, Developing Board Practices that Impact Corporate Renewal and Performance. which we published recently in a very nice journal of risk management in financial institutions. And this is very much a teamwork from a long range of collaborations here together with Liselott, Ludo, Henrik, and Fernanda. So this is joint effort and joint results. Now, I come from the innovation area, so I was really intrigued here by David's nice presentation. And of course, risk is fundamental also in innovation, but I primarily work with people who are innovators or entrepreneurs. And we know from research that one of their biases is that they are too optimistic about things. That's good for world economy, actually, it has been shown. But coming into the area of boards, I realize, of course, that these two sides, the risk and opportunity, become very obvious for board directors. And this has been at the core of our research. And I will not talk so much about innovation here, but I will talk about renewal and strategy. And in the field of strategy, we have for a very long time, actually since 1997, talked about how outdated many of our strategic models are, that they are basically based on a static framework where we have sustained competitive advantage. And we have questioned that for now almost 30 years. However, we still see that we still rely a lot on those models, but there are some streams of both research and practice in the field of strategic management that can help us. In particular, there is a strong stream of research on dynamic capabilities, which is basically the logic here is that we have capabilities that make it possible for us to offer something of value to our stakeholders. And these capabilities are what we have right now. However, as the environment changes, and the environment normally changes in a rather abrupt and sometimes disruptive way, we need to adjust our capabilities. And that is when the dynamic capabilities come into play. The dynamic capabilities are the things that allow us to change our capabilities, our resources, our offerings. And very often this has been presented as composed out of three different things. Our capability to sense different changes in environment, our capability to seize opportunities, and our capability to transform an organization. From a board's perspective, when we started working on this, we didn't really feel that this was a perfect set of concepts. So instead, we have seen that with a slight change, this is much more understandable. Basically, it's about sensing, actually understanding what's going on outside or inside, pivoting, which basically means seeing the different alternatives, trying them out, and making bold decisions. And in the end, aligning this with what we already have. So if we should summarize all these 30 years of research, we actually see that organizations need dynamic capabilities. But we also see that this has implications for boards. Boards do not only control the corporation and its management, that they also should steer the corporation and management towards effective renewal. So boards need dynamic capabilities. And the overall question in our publication here is, how should boards organize themselves and develop their dynamic board capabilities to support and govern corporate renewal and performance effectively? Now, this is based on research, but it is a practice paper. And I am really proud of that because there's too much academic research that stays in academia. But here, I think the combination of the authors here has allowed us to both show and validate that these ideas actually hold with some statistical analysis, but also picking up a number of potentially helpful and fruitful practices that boards can actually apply tomorrow. So please change. The first thing here is briefly just telling you that what we talk about here, as I said, is research-based. We ran some surveys in two large funded projects here in Sweden. And we see here that we had a model where we looked at these three different areas or capabilities, sensing, pivoting, and aligning. And then we looked at how they influenced innovation performance and economic performance, respectively. And actually, this is very schematic. I'm an engineer, I have to admit that. What we see is that sensing, our ability to actually see changes, influences innovation. So we become better at spotting innovation opportunities and hopefully acting upon them. However, the acting is needed in terms of, first of all, some pivoting. And we see that pivoting is also influencing our innovation performance in a positive way. And without sensing, we cannot pivot. Now, one of the really interesting things is then that we see there is an arrow and influence on from pivoting to economic performance where there is a negative side. This means that pivoting basically is, of course, costly. Trying out new things doesn't happen for free. There are resources going into that. So in the short run, innovation is costly. However, in the long run, we see its benefits through innovation performance and through the aligning with others. And there was a good question here. Does innovation performance come before economic performance? Well, if we look at economic performance as the economic value creation, I would say that it comes before that. But normally, of course, there's also a cycle here that it's difficult to innovate if we are not performing well. There are exceptions if we are in an extreme crisis, but normally I would actually say that innovation builds a long-term value. Now, you can have a closer look at that in our paper, of course. What I would like to highlight here, and I won't go through all the information in these slides, are just to highlight a few important things about these board dynamic capabilities. The first thing is about how can the board become better at sensing? Well, it's all about enhancing the board insight about the environment and how the corporation strategy and organization fits with that environment. And there are two main areas that the boards need to attend to. The first thing is to actively scan for environmental changes. So how do we actually use the board so that they are adding new information, new insights, new knowledge to the decision-making when it comes to the strategy of an organization. One very important thing here is that the board should do this not completely relying on information and knowledge from management. That would actually limit the potential influence of the board here. So boards need to think about how do we also gather information and data independently from management? What mechanism do we have for that? And of course, when things are changing all the time, the strategy should not be to change all the time everything. Then we are just following the flow. There will be no strategic competitive advantage from that. It's about understanding what should be changed. And what we have seen here is that what we can actually see and hold on to in a very fluctuating world is the purpose of our organization. The purpose will be something that can help us. What should we stick to and what should we actually question and change? So on the right hand here, there are some really practical questions about what we can do. I will not go into them, but actually those are questions that boards should sit down and discuss. The pivoting capabilities are really about how do we create a portfolio of strategic options and initiatives that include renewal and innovation. And here there are two main areas. One is to actually embrace what David indicated before, that we need to address both risks and opportunities. Of course, the board has responsibilities to handle risk, but also to make sure that the organizations addresses opportunities that can build value in the long run. Now here, we of course see that this has to be done looking into how this actually happens over a longer period of time. Also, the board should be active in making sure that we explore this potential for change. And here it's important to remember that sometimes we have inherent uncertainty that we cannot solve by just gathering more information or waiting. The future sometimes has to be discovered. we need to be very proactive and trying out. So what this calls for is, how do we perform experimentation or probing in a structured and effective way? So this really tells us that how does the board work together with management to make sure that we try out the right things, to gather information to see whether a strategic option should be is interesting for us or not. And the last thing is, of course, then the board aligning capabilities. We do not have infinite resources, so if we actually have initiatives that we need to fund, we need to go into a discussion about how we should reallocate resources so that in the end we get an effective implementation and can deliver and capture that value. So what we see here is, of course, first of all, how do we help out in implementing the lessons from the pivots? Very often here we see that we can benefit from thinking about different time horizons, the McKinsey model, or the innovation ambition matrix. What should we focus upon that is related to our core, to our adjacent areas, to transformative innovation, for instance? How much should we allocate to these different innovation initiatives or renewal initiatives? And of course, it's all about rebalancing in the end, the value capture. Let me see. Oh, sorry, I was almost thrown out by my system here. And to oversee and balance these short, medium, and long-term objectives. And that may also mean that we have to realign our processes, our priorities, our resources, and also sometimes even change culture. So very briefly put, this is what's in the paper, and I hope that I have triggered some interest for it, and that if you need to, of course, look more closely into it, please read the paper. We would love if more people actually looked into it. And it's actually very, it's written in a rather simple way, I would say. It is a practice paper, so there's not a lot of statistics or very traditional, sometimes we could say boring academic descriptions of how we did the research. But basically, it's about what to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mats. That was a real challenge to present all of that in such a short time. Thank you so much. Now we have asked Ludo to actually think about two very current opportunities and challenges that we have in our hand as board members, which is sustainability and AI. And Ludo is the Professor Emeritus from INSEAD. I can see that several of us on the call has also had the phenomenal opportunity to actually learn from Professor Ludo van der Heyden in the corporate governance groups that we have at INSEAD. He's also a chairman and a board member on several boards, which adds also to his fantastic experience. So Ludo, over to you.
Hi, Liselott, thank you very much. My question was to talk a little bit about artificial intelligence and also about sustainability and climate change. And I think these are two fantastic areas for applying the model. And let me just repeat a little bit what our dear colleague Matt said, which is, you can't decide things if you don't sense them. I think that's sort of the key notion. And I think the word sensing we chose because sensing is not just understanding, because there is actually there's a great book by Pfeffer of Stanford, for example, The Knowing-Doing Gap. And I think the knowing-doing gap comes because in a certain way, you know it intellectually, but you're not scared shitless, that you might end up in bankruptcy or something like that. So that is the sensing in the fullest sense of the word, which is the board needs to sense what is going to happen to the organization before it actually happens. I mean, that is sort of in a certain way risk management or risk oversight. And that is a very difficult activity. And I should say, or I mean, people here are knowledgeable about governance, so they know we're coming from quite a distance. And the distance is that the past is that boards were basically supervising execution. And so even I still had a few years ago, we have this course for board members, where the general view is that innovation is largely the job of executives, or corporate renewal should come from bottom up. But if you take what I call a neoclassical view, which is that the board is actually responsible for the organization, then it is responsible for survival and also for performance. And so you also, in the neoclassical view, governance comes from steering. You must actually look forward. So you must actually sense the future in order to be able to decide confidently. And I think maybe one of the reasons was sort of an intellectual reason, that people thought that governance is control, is supervision. And that's a very short-term view and a very narrow view. And one of the problems with the future is it's very hard to get a sense of the future. So you actually, you're subjected to the future. And I think here the issue is steering the ship being the organization, using the governance metaphor of the captain of the ship. So steering the ship so that it keeps creating value for the stakeholders and of course for the shareholders, etc. Now that is an impossible task. So I think one way, if you're lazy, if you're intelligent, you just delegate that to the executives, and that is the easiest way. The problem is the value added of the board then is negative, but at least it's not destructive. Because the worst thing is to control things you don't understand. And then you're going to block things, or you're going to steer people in a direction. And I mean, that is what we learned from the financial crisis, which is boards were clueless about these sort of risk mitigating products. And even executives seem to be relatively clueless. So nothing worked. So I would say part of the reason that boards didn't go into innovation is because it's damn hard, and innovation is the most inefficient activity you can think of. I mean, it's a waste of time. So if you have the culture of we need to be efficient, and what I hate the most about board meetings is efficiency. Then you can't even. Then you basically say, look, the only thing we can efficiently understand is financial statements about the last 5 years. That we can study because that is static, that is not changing anymore. And so people have sort of, in a certain way, been driven to examining the past. And let me stop here because I still need to address the two issues, and I'm looking at the time. I think what this paper tries to contribute to is a model for board work that gets people practically focused on actually how do you steer when the future is uncertain. And now you have two very different ways, which is you co-create the future, like Apple or Microsoft or Google, or you react to the future, which is your passive. Now, if you are going to, of course, again, if you're reacting, that is not sort of, I would say, a performance. Because reacting is Nokia co-created the future and then lost it. That's really where the high premium is. Now, it is true that if you go into examples, it is largely the work of executives. So what the paper tries to do is, here's a framework, so at least you can be responsible. Not that you can be highly performing, but at least you can responsibly exercise your fiduciary duty about steering the ship into the future. That's really all the paper does. And the answer is shift your attention from supervising execution to actually sensing what is happening to the future, and then pivot, make some experiments so that you actually put your hands dirty, you make some commitments and some investments. And then finally, you align the strategy of the company, with what you learn from these experiments. So it's a very different practice. It's a very different view of board work. I think it's a neoclassical view. It's always was meant to be this way, but somehow we got into this view very short term, you know, sort of let's just supervise execution. That's not good. Now let me turn to what the questions are. Sustainability, that's a beauty, because we already start with words that are meaningless. The world is not sustainable. Nothing is sustainable. No organization is sustainable. So the worst thing is you start talking, you know, about fluff or about dreams, because the reality is everything is being transformed. And so nothing repeats. And the worst thing is, you know, this hour will not repeat. So now we start governing with the wrong words. Good luck, you know. Now then you say, okay, we have gotten it. United Nations Sustainable Development Goals 16. Every company suddenly was green because on criteria 3, 5, 7 they were AAA. So suddenly, you know, by using the words, people were picking, and they said, now we're fine. Finally, the sustainability challenge cannot be solved except for innovation by a single company. It has to be solved at industrial level. So companies like oil companies, energy companies need to start cooperating. That is very different than competitive strategy. And that is, I think, where the board comes in to sort of say, no, well, you know, it's not just about being better than the others. We need to actually be together better. And we need to, you know, sort of build a more sustainable future for our ecosystem in which the industry works. So I would say sustainability, that is not the word. The real issue is erosion, change, and of course, climate change. And then I think we need to have different measures. The measures are quite clear, which is a contribution to you know, greenhouse gases, contribution to biodiversity. We need to have different measures and not financial measures. We need to, and that I think is where the board, I think, needs to take a stake and say, for us in the fight for sustainability, these are the measures that will be important. And I think that finally should be a board decision. And that should not be left to the executives, because the executives will pick out what's easy or what is nice. So for example, if you change strategy, then normally you might have to change CEOs, because if you change the measure, you know, then you need to change, if you need to change the sport, you need to change the athlete. So basically, I think defining the words, but not just defining the words, because then you're back in the knowing-doing gap. It is actually understanding the words and getting a sense of what's happening. And this leads me to the second question, which is artificial intelligence. We do not know where we are going. Most organizations, first, I realized, studying the subject a little bit, that I actually did a dissertation at Yale University on artificial intelligence. You know, it was not a very sophisticated way, but I was already doing artificial intelligence. So artificial intelligence is actually the final step where everything would be automated and all the thinking will be done by robots or avatars. That is actually not a bad world for directors, because the only thing that you cannot delegate is a responsibility. So actually the only sustainable job is being a director, because everything else will be automated. So we won't need managers anymore. You know, we'll just need robots and avatars for execution. So artificial intelligence is, what are the real choices? And I think the real challenge that companies have today, again, it is stupid to do this alone. You need to do this collectively, collaboratively, with startups, with you know, consortium programs. You let Google, you know, and Google and Microsoft and OpenAI, whatever, do this for you. But you need to understand how the AI will affect you. And that is, I think nobody has the answer here. So people understand what is AI research. So that is pivoting, you know, and what kind of research should you do in a company? Well, it's the research that the others don't do, because if the others do it, then you just go to conferences, you know, don't invest. So you need to have an AI strategy, and that will be my final comment, which is everybody talks about strategy and business strategy, sometimes digital strategy, now AI strategy. But what the paper tries to get at is how do you build a board strategy to face all these issues? So you cannot impact the organization, you cannot impact the world, you cannot impact the stakeholders if you do not have your own board strategy. And now that is a radical change from board work as supervision versus board work as identifying the challenges and the opportunities. Then pivoting, which means exploration, startups, ventures, collaborative ventures, going to conferences and basically telling your researchers, don't research AI, just go and visit Google or go to conferences, which is do the Google thing, which is copy and steal mercilessly, and don't pay for it. So that would be a good innovation strategy. And then finally, how does all this exploration affect your strategy, which you've decided in the past? And I think so in that sense, the paper is common sense. But as we say in organizations, one loses common sense quite quickly. I think David made a good point, which is fear. So, my mother always said is what I don't know doesn't hurt my feelings. So let's not talk, because that's going to make things worse. Well, that's the opposite of board work. We need to talk about what we don't understand. We need to get a better sense of it. And I think it was actually sort of making sense of what is the board responsibility in a world of uncertainty and risk. But I would say the difference with uncertainty and risk in the sense of Frank Knight is we don't even know what the outcomes are. We don't even know what the probabilities are. And so we need to be back to exploring, which is actually the governance task, which is there is a governance of steering the ship in known with the known direction, and then there's a task of steering the ship in uncertain waters when you don't know what the goal really should be, when you don't know what the destination will be. And I think that leads to the conclusion that boards have to be ambidextrous. That's the famous, well-known word, which is you need to continue to supervise to responsibility, but you need to spend more time precisely because it's so inefficient of trying to predict the future. And frankly, the people who like certainty are the worst people to actually explore uncertainty. So you need to actually have a different board, and maybe you need to have two boards. That's the other structural response, which is I actually think going to the future, I think boards probably, you cannot do this all together because you don't have the same profiles, because it's very inefficient, because you don't want to say, okay, it's we have 20 minutes, let's close it. So I think you need to have a sustainability committee, or you need to have an artificial intelligence committee, or as we say, you need to have an innovation and change and renewal committee of the board, because that committee will spend most of the time, and at the end of the year, we've done a lot of exploration, but we may not have found the answer yet. And that requires a certain persistence and patience that many board members don't have.
Now I like to invite the panel back, and we're adding, besides the presenters, also, as we mentioned, Helen. So I'll make a short introduction to you about Helen. So Helen is really a seasoned board chair and non-executive director, and has the joy of sitting on a lot of audit committees, which means that she's getting all of the sustainability and risk and everything in her area. And she works on several of the different types of companies, ownership types of companies, and she's actually also president of the INSEAD Directors Network. And on top of that, in terms of actually thinking about fear, she's actually an executive coach. And if you're really interested, I have done a podcast interview with Helen that you can listen to. Warm welcome, Helen.
Thank you.
So I actually thought I'd ask a bit around the what are you doing to actually keep yourself updated and keep yourself knowledgeable about the market changes? Do you want to start with that, Helen?
Yeah, no, I'd be more than happy to. I don't know if anybody's ever done, talking of coaching, if anybody's ever done Clifton Strengths, but one of my dominant strengths is called input, and input is this complete sponge for information. So I'm probably sensing from the moment I wake up until until the moment I go to bed. So how do I do it? I mean, obviously through lots of reading, financial press, economists, things like that, industry-based reading. I'm a prolific governance director, taker of courses. So I'll give Boards Impact Forum a real good plug here with their Responsible AI program. I can heartily recommend it. I've just graduated. It's really in depth. I've also been involved with the Sustainability Board doing their sustainability leadership program. And indeed, I'll give David a plug as well, because I've also been involved with, with his program around risk and cyber risk. So you might ask, how the hell do you keep abreast of all of that? Or am I weird? It's survival. And what I mean by that is, I'm a board director, I'm on commercial boards, we're on the front line. The pace of change that we've already highlighted is massive. And, I see A as my responsibility, and B, frankly, I don't want to be caught short. I want to be able to add value as best as I can in my role, and because I enjoy the role.
Thank you so much, Helen. Ludo, I know that you've been sitting on some tricky boards and where you might see things earlier than other. So now when you're seeing things, how do you share that with the board, and how do you get them to kind of see what you're seeing?
First, I find it much easier to teach governance than to do it. So I think it's sort of in a certain way, it keeps me humble. I think what I notice is that you can have some models, you can have some ideas, but strong board members will immediately come up and say, no, that's wrong. So the tolerance, innovation requires a tolerance for dissonance. And that tolerance for dissonance, I find quite difficult. So just to illustrate, people have models in their heads about what boards should do. And they don't sort of say, look, this is what I want to do as a director. This is my value added, which I think would be a very useful discussion. And I think that was my point about board strategy. You sort of say, how are we going to sense together, and together us, and then together with the executives. And basically people have strong views and we don't talk about it. And that when you then open up the change issue, then immediately people start saying, no, that's wrong. Say, and in science, normally the reaction is why might this be right, or what is the thing that is right about that? And I think executives which are very top down, very authoritarian, will not sort of tolerate sensing. I mean, I was coaching a board, or not coaching, but I was partly coaching a board, and clearly the CEO was very driven, and he wanted to impose his view on the board. And I said, there's going to be a collision, and indeed, some board members left a few months later, because that's a missed opportunity.
Right.
And I think I wouldn't say that I'm very good at sensing. The first thing is, if you want to be independent in Ukraine, for example, being a foreigner is a big help.
Right.
Because you can really say what you think, and you say if they don't like it, then you leave, with the train now, or but the problem is with independent is you're too far from the action.
Yeah.
And so I should say that my key advice is have more discussions of how do we sense together? Do we have scenarios that we are not prepared for?
Right.
And I think that's quite difficult, actually. And the biggest frustration for me is, we don't have time.
Yeah.
What's your point?
Yeah.
And okay, let's delegate it to the management. The management will deal with that.
Yeah.
And then what is the answer of the management? Things are in control, so you don't really get ahead. So I actually think this steering in the responsibly steering in the future, we must have a model which is not the model of each board member, but the model of a board, which is and then once you have a model, because everybody has models in there, but you can't create a board model unless people align with the board model explicitly. And I think that's very, very needed. And I think that takes some time, and that is actually far from obvious. So that would be my advice.
Thank you so much, Ludo. I can tell you that you have taught me a question that I use probably at least at every other board meeting, and that is, well, if we were to think the opposite, what would that mean? Which is
that's a counterfactual. And I should say, to illustrate my point, now that you mention it, a lot of things come in. But we had a CEO in IDP, and he actually came back and he said, my key learning is when I join the board, I take the viewpoint of the organization, not my own. So I started to say, well, maybe it's time to change the CEO. And people looked at me and say, but you're the CEO. And he said, yeah, but frankly, I love the job, but I'm not sure I'm the best one. And I think that's the kind of openness you need in order to have these sensing discussions. And that is, in many cultures, the immediate answer is, oh, you're not committed? You want to get out? And the answer is no. I'm now taking the board view, which is maybe there's a better CEO here, and that would plead for a separation of roles.
Right. Thank you so much for sharing that, David. I'm coming to you, and one of the things that's been talked about a lot are scenarios. So I wanted to pick your brain a bit about, are boards really working with scenarios, and what do you see that makes it easier for them to actually get some scenarios in that they can work with?
Well, I think they're essential, and it's not necessarily that they'd be right. They're essential for conversation. They're essential for networking. They're essential for trust building, essential for challenging, as you had said. I mean, the thought going through my mind as I heard Helen and Ludo speaking and Mutz earlier was, I'd love to have an hour to amplify everything you guys just said. There's so many things there that are important. This conversation, I was looking at the clock and saying, I can't believe this is going to end so soon. There's just a lot here. Very quickly, I'm just going to make a point to what Ludo said, and then I'll get back to the scenario stuff. The book I wrote called Governance Reimagined about 12 years ago, the last section of the book is called The King is Dead. And what I meant by that was this idea of the CEO imposing their will is gone. That's the model that cannot survive. And to some degree, that's true of the board as well. So in our small group, I had mentioned that boards may be the single biggest risk an organization faces because they're not capable, and humans generally are not capable of evolving as quickly as some of the issues that we're dealing with because of the amplifications, because of the technology. So where do scenarios fit into that? Well, there are ones that help you identify gaps, help you identify your slowness. The ability to respond to something you didn't expect is essential. So in the journal that you'd mentioned, the article that I put in there, I talk about dividing the future into two halves. The first half is the one that exceeds your expectations, right? So how do we build a portfolio of ideas that in essence becomes a venture capital portfolio in the organization? Lots and lots of small risks. You allow the ones that work well to run. The other half is the part that is below your expectations. How do you get in the way of those so that they don't reach their full potential? And this is where the networking and the empowerment and the distribution of responsibility comes into play. I was part at one organization of a problem response team that had been empowered by the organization to make any decision it felt necessary to interrupt an emerging issue. And we met several times. We had full trust that we were empowered to do whatever we wanted, and we saved the organization significant reputational and financial impact because of that empowerment. So that's one way to focus on that part of the distribution that goes against your expectations. The goal then is to create what I call a positively skewed future, which means you're enhancing the ability to gain upside, you're interfering with the downside, the disappointment, and that's a culture that the board can create, but it's not a culture that the board can do. It's not that the board can make those decisions. And so testing in these scenarios helps you see that You may not have that culture. You may not have those things in place. And it'll allow you then to maybe more confidently pivot. And pivot was the one that I chose as the hardest, because actually making the decision to do something is the exercise of a real option. And as soon as you've exercised the option, that's the route you're going.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. I will now ask Mats a question, but before that, I want the rest of you to prepare to actually give our participants one recommendation each, small or large. Mats, you worked a lot with innovation, and I know you have a lot of views on innovation, but we're actually now going into an era where boards needs to find some ways to actually engage with innovation. Have you seen some good ways that you think that boards should actually do or be better at that helps them with that?
Well, that's a good question, since many of my boards are probably not engaged that much in innovation and technological innovation. I would actually make an analogy with the problems and the possibilities I see in organizations at large. And one of the big challenges has already been touched upon here by Ludo, and that is really how do we deal with experimentation? Because it's always difficult to defend an innovation. Innovations are very easy to kill because they are uncertain, sometimes ambiguous. So it's always very easy to disregard them and say that we don't have arguments. So we basically can disregard them based upon what we have done in the past, or that it seems that we miss important pieces of knowledge. So we need to create those pieces of knowledge. And that we can only do by embracing actually the scientific method, which I think is at the core of all entrepreneurial and innovative ideas. It's about finding out which are the assumptions we have and then try them out. So when we have a strategic dilemma, which are the assumptions that make us wonder why we're not deciding upon this? And then can we actually bring that down to a not too costly and quick experiment or probe? Then we have something that we can actually evaluate. So we need to do that. The last thing I would like to do is, of course, that the importance of championship. A lot of innovations happen emerging in organizations, but they need to be protected. They are very, very fragile initially. It's very easy to kill innovation. All of us could do it without any problem. We probably have, and some of it was also right, because many ideas are not innovations, and many ideas are bad. So, but it's the role of a chair, which we have not talked so much about here today. But very many of the practices we are talking about here, and also we talked about in the group, the one who can really make them happen is the chair. So the responsibility of the chair in creating the right climate for these discussions is fundamental. First of all, that we allocate time to this. That's very much up to the chair. Second thing, just like innovation in general, that if we deal with innovation, we deal with uncertainty, that means we deal with failure. We need to handle failure. We sometimes are wrong. And I'm not sure that everyone in a boardroom feels comfortable with being wrong at times, but we are, of course. So how do you create that climate? How do we create a culture where it's okay to try out ideas, and sometimes we were wrong?
Right. Thank you so much, Mats. Helen, what recommendation do you have to the board members here?
Gosh. I've got one really simple one, and then one that's maybe a bit more involved. I think it's around curiosity. I'll frame it around that. There's a saying that, somebody in my world often says is, when are you never wrong? Is when you're asking a question. And that's one way to get around that fear of not knowing. But what I've found is through all the sensing work and really thinking through, what's the best question that I can ask that's going to give me maximum, bang for my buck, if you like. And then asking that question, knowing that there won't be an immediate answer. But what I do know is it then gets recorded in the minutes and ends up in the matters arising. So that means that it has to be addressed in some way. And if it's not addressed appropriately, I'm not about to go and beat people up. But, then think about, well, how can I ask the question a different way, which then builds to the other piece where one of the reasons why I love audit committee work is because it gets you closer to the organization. If I see numbers as symbols, they reveal patterns. And also they give you the ability, in order to be able to understand that, they give you the ability to have conversations and to have conversations right across the organization, which fuels my curiosity, particularly around understanding, ultimately it depends on the organization, but it's about customers. What are the challenges that your clients are facing or your customers are facing is going to come straight back into the organization. So I use those opportunities to build relationships, to fuel my curiosity, to ask better questions. And to understand what some of the dynamics might be that are going on, so I can think about how I frame some of my questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Helen. Now, David and Ludo, I have a big challenge for you. Can you try to give a recommendation in 30 seconds? David,
goes first?
Enroll in Ludo's program.
No.
Endorse that.
No, I think I just have one more thing, which is related with ESG. I think we need to reframe the questions, and I think the whole idea is to be more collaborative. And in that sense, the counterfactual of what the oil and gas companies did on our way to the climate catastrophe that we're going through, which is they did not have a collective statement, and in fact they fought against it. They actually put in a lot of black smoke. So I would say, in terms of AI and sustainability, which is the question that you asked me, Lieslot, I would say work at it. Try to work at it with others. Don't try to figure it out, and then try to see what are the sweet spots. What is it we can move forward on quickly that goes in the right direction? That would be my question. But a lot of these questions on sustainability, it's not a firm decision. It's not a firm that's going to solve the climate catastrophe. It's society and it's industries, and not just regionally. Maybe EU level is the most, but it's actually globally. So that is sort of the call for the global compact. And that is a question that executives are not trained for. And I think that's an area that's really for boards.
Right.
Lieslot, can I add just a little bit?
Of course.
To echo again something, or maybe amplify something Ludo said. Lately, my writing's been under this theme of we reimagined. And what I mean by that is to start looking at organizations and the systems within we work as living entities, and see them as a collective, and then you govern them that way. So, Ludo's point about working collectively, it has to go outside of the boundaries that we're used to seeing. So you see the corporate boundary, you have to look outside that. You see the community boundary, you have to look outside that. The political boundary, the political economy boundary, you have to look outside those and reimagine what we mean by we. And that extends all the way out to the environment and the planet. So you get to a whole different perspective when you start talking, like what Ludo had said, about how we work together.
Right. Thank you so much. And now I'm going to see if I can plug you into a couple of things. So all of you guys that are certified board members, we have a very interesting reunion coming up on June 24th. On June 25, we have a fantastic new event. We have actually done a piece of research where we have looked at how are board members using AI for the board work, and how could they use AI for the board work. So we will have Professor Gabrielsson with 2 of his students, and we will also have Stephanie Werner from MIT sharing her ongoing board work on digitalization and how boards can actually use it within sustainability. So do join that. We have, thank you so much, Helen. We have the next cohort of the board's AI coming up, starting in August, going on to October, with some phenomenal presenters. We have a number of events that we're doing together with the other chapters in climate governance initiatives, and you find them all on our website. And there's also, for those of you who are a bit interested in the technology side, there's a really interesting summit that is also free that you can join. the Good Governance Academy. I'm going to lead a panel on that. And of course, do look into the Risk Governance Institute, which has a number of really relevant programs, and I would have to say also very easily consumed for a busy board director. So in the end, I just want to say my warmest thank you to Helen and David and Mats and Ludo for actually sharing all of your insights. I know we could have used more time. We'll just have to bring us together again. Thank you so much. Also warm thanks to Henrik, Fernanda, James, all of you, and all warmest thank you for all of you ambitious board directors. I think you should feel how good you are that is actually trying to get the grasp on all of these complex topics. Thank you so much and warm welcome back.
Thank you, Liselott, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you.